Hello and welcome to the Futurist Letters show. My name is Cairo Smith. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Futurist Letters, the journal. I am also the host of the Futurist Letters show. Today we don't have a guest, we have a roundtable discussion. I am joined by my wonderful, incomparable co-hosts, Nathan Eidingen. Hey, Nathan.
Hi, happy to
And Kenny
be with
White. Hey,
everyone.
Kenny.
Hey, what's up, guys?
And we have the full crew here for a discussion of the first half, give or take, of Lee Kuan Yew's book, From Third World to First, which we have been mentioning throughout the month that we were going to be doing a little bit of a book club on. So if you have read this, listen along. If you have not read it, you can also listen along, maybe get something out of it. Maybe this will encourage you to go take a look or not take a look. Or if you would like to read along and then listen, you can always come back to this episode at that time. But we will be going through, maybe jumping around a little bit, talking about our reflections, what we've picked up on from the book, and then using that to segue into a fairly casual conversation about what's going on in the world, because that's the way these roundtable episodes are going to work. So there is no after show for this episode. The whole thing is free, and if you want to sponsor the show, this is where your sponsor message will go. So please consider becoming a sponsor. You'll get a lot of listens now and in the future. You will support our work. You will make content like this possible, and you will get your brand out there. So please go to futuristletters.com to watch the show with video. You can also watch it with video on YouTube, and you can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else. So with that, I guess, I think I'll kick it to Nathan first, because I believe Nathan was the one who pitched this. Nathan, what was your experience reading this book?
Um, so I think we're all converted to the PAP cause of Lee Kuan Yew at this point, having read um, most of his book. I don't think any of us have finished it so far. We said we would do half for this episode. And I think the thing about the book, reading it, is that, first of all, I think it should be said that he is a good writer. His prose is quite lovely to read, but that in many ways the book is a victory lap for him in that he's chronicling his career and everything that got him to the point that he was, but also that I find it just very interesting how non-ideological he is. He is just really, really, to the extent that people say, oh, he's a pragmatist, it really is true that he just does not really have a defining ideology. And he is willing to admit when like things don't work, and he just will take tack in a completely different direction. And his philosophy is really based around the state having capacity and being able to execute executive action effectively and quickly. And I thought it was a fascinating read. I think the first thing that jumps out to me when you first start the book, when he's talking about the separation from Malaysia and building up an independent military and defense force and defense policy, is how much he says outright that Singapore's military was designed by Israel and after Israel, as well as its development was modeled after Israel as well. And I knew that we had a special relationship with them, and it's been characterized as a special relationship. But he really goes on the book to display like, no, it was actually like they flew over people, and they were the people who designed the whole thing from top to bottom. And
Yeah,
I
the
just thought that was really
Israelis
interesting. Yeah.
whom they were claiming publicly were Mexicans because
Yes.
they were
Yes. They
trying to
claimed
keep
it.
the heat off from the Indonesians and Malaysians. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They didn't want to piss off the Muslim Malay minority, but yeah, I think they brought in a team of like, what was it? Like it was only like about a dozen or so Israelis who then taught and designed the whole military and devised their conscription structure, their military culture, It's also why they have such a casual culture. The idea of the military as being kind of a leveling tool through society so that everyone also has a share, that it kind of molds like a multi-ethnic society into a single entity. And then even economically, he talks about how he looked around and he's like, huh, we're surrounded by these hostile countries who are not as economically developed as us. We need to leapfrog the region, as it were. And it was he also looked again there in the 60s. And so I thought, especially for me, I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Kenny, what were some of your takeaways reading this?
Well, as I was reading it, I had a bit of almost like a political scientist, economist lens, and there were a couple of interesting things about Singapore from like an economic development standpoint, which is how did this fairly poor, backward society, from an economic standpoint, become one of the most advanced and wealthy countries in the world, and let's say within one lifespan. And it was really interesting to see like his approach to like Western manufacturing and Western, specifically American corporations in the early days. It felt like in his mind, like a lot of the leaders of these countries were looking for handouts, and he was like, "We're not looking for handouts. We just want to do business." And
Yeah.
he did this very, very smart and prudent export-oriented strategy, and he tried very hard to attract businesses to invest in Singapore. And one of the really
Yeah.
interesting puzzles about Singapore from like a Western political science standpoint is we have this idea that the rule of law is very important for investment because it establishes like property rights. Because if you don't have the rule of law and you invest all this money in building a factory, what's going to stop the state from just appropriating that factory from you if it ever becomes successful? And so therefore the incentive to build that factory is very low. And you see that problem in societies like Russia, for example. If you get too successful in Russia, I don't know, maybe unless you become an oligarch yourself and have like the right connections and the right friendships, like your success might not stay your success for very long. And what's interesting about Singapore is, on the one hand, they're able to enforce these property rights. Like I think when they are working on developing their oil refinery business, they had like a decent amount of oil storage in Singapore, like leading up to the Arab oil embargo in the 70s. And when the oil embargo happened, he said they had enough oil there for like 2 years for Singapore's to match Singapore's consumption for 2 years. And instead of like appropriating that for the people, he said to all like the oil companies, like, "Hey, we're not taking any of this. You guys do
Yeah.
whatever you want with it."
That stood out to me as well. Both that he did it, meaning not appropriate the oil during the oil shock, but also that he mentioned it as a point of pride. He really is, I guess you would say, a globalist, right? Like, as much as he wanted Singapore to be self-sufficient, he wasn't doing it with this sort of, nationalizing autarky.
I, I
Well,
would
I think
disagree with that, actually. I would say that he is a nationalist. I wouldn't say he's a globalist at all. He talks
Well,
about
do you
at
think that
length.
nationalism and globalism are contradictory?
100%. But also, he himself talks all the time about how all of the things that happen in Singapore politically and economically need to suit the needs of not just Singapore as an overall government entity and state, but Singaporeans in general. And he talks about how he will use the state to do things that Western countries will not. And he criticizes liberal democracies consistently through the book in this way. Like he is not
I think
afraid of
this is a
using the state,
yeah.
especially politically in regards to political freedoms. Like I think the newspapers is actually a good one, where he requires all the media in Singapore to be owned by Singaporeans. That he does
But
not want a
this
foreign
has nothing
media
to do with
presence.
globalism in the sense of free trade. I mean,
I mean,
he
even in
seems
the sense of free trade, he talks about using tariffs as a tool in the book. He wants a free trade environment, like a environment where trade is conducive to trade, but he is not afraid to having an industrial policy for Singapore. It's not a laissez-faire environment even for trade. I don't think it's fair to say that he's like a trade globalist. Like you look at all of these Asian tigers, and they had heavy government intervention in each of them.
You know, if you go back to like the
And I think this also, I'm sorry, Kenny, just to finish what I was saying,
oh,
uh, I think it's interesting, especially with the rule of law, which I think it is true, Kenny, what you're talking about, that he is a lawyer, that was his occupation, but also that he comes from a labor background. He comes from a Socialist Party background, even though he writes later in the book about how much he loves Maggie and Maggie Thatcher, and he's completely done with neoliberalism as we understand it. Um, I think it's just I don't think it's fair to say that he's a globalist or that like um, I don't think he ever in his mind would think that like the corporations we act on their behalf for Singapore. I think he saw it as these corporations will be beneficial to Singapore. If they were not, then he would just not accept their business.
I think
well,
I
I think
might have just said a trigger word because I don't disagree with anything you said. Uh,
well,
so
I think
let's maybe not get hung up on the idea of globalism
that's
as
where
a
the oil
term.
refining example kind of shows. I think I kind of agree with what Nathan's saying in the sense that like the oil refining example, like I think he prioritized like Singapore's national interest, but he
Yeah,
saw that in like a holistic long term
yeah,
context. And so he's like, okay, well, maybe in the short term this could help us deal
Yeah.
with the price shock, but in the long term, the real play is to create an environment where international corporations feel like they can trust Singapore with their money and their capital investment, and that's how we grow in the long term. And so
Yeah.
I think what's really fascinating to me and something that I felt like wasn't really answered by reading the book was how are they able to have this very strong state that works on behalf of the people, but also is able to protect property rights, even property of non-stakeholders in the government. Um,
I think he does answer it in the book. I think, one thing that he talks about, and I think we talked about this ourselves before, is that, in a lot of Western countries, if you are an ambitious person who is smart and hardworking, especially in the United States, you don't go into government. That is just not a path that you go into. Whereas in Singapore, he made it a direct policy that he wanted to attract talent into the civil service. He wanted to attract talent into the
Yeah.
government. He made the salaries for government positions to be very high, not just to reduce corruption, but also to attract talent. He specifically looked because everyone was going through the military, and you could spot talent in the military for who was smart and who was hardworking. And he would scout talent within the military as a direct transition to the civil service as well. And I
That
think
seemed to
that's
me to be
how,
very effective,
yeah,
the salary policies. And it's interesting. In that and in other places, he talks about it's almost a sidebar, but he does talk about having to get these things through the legislature and also repeatedly campaign. As much as he says that somebody called him like a Saddam Hussein dictator, right? But he was still clearly having to drum up votes and win the opposition over to get things passed, right? At many points.
yeah, I mean, like he won eight, I think it was eight elections, if I'm not mistaken. But I also
Yeah.
think that's points to his ability to continue to deliver results on the ground. It's hard to,
Yeah.
but also this is not so uncommon, especially in like East Asian countries that are democratic, like, Taiwan until pretty recently was run by the Kuomintang. Japan has almost always been led by the LDP. Uh,
I guess
Especially in
here's
like a small country, it's not hard for me to imagine a one-party dominant
here's a
state.
question that came into my head specifically regarding the press thing. And as an American, someone who's been acculturated into American values, I can't help but take a special interest specifically in regard to the parts where he is proudly talking about the way Singapore differs from American values, which is not to say that either the American or the Singaporean values are better or worse. But in regards to the press, he was talking about the U.S. press specifically um, chafing against the uh, strong arm that Singapore used when they would print something that they found to be inaccurate, or specifically the law was that if something inaccurate was printed about Singapore, the publication would have to verbatim print a letter from the Singaporean government explaining what they had done wrong. And if they didn't want to do that, what he would do is they would reduce the number of copies of that publication that would be allowed to be sold in the in the state. And I just wonder. Obviously, he brought up very good points about freedom of the press not leading necessarily to a healthy democracy. He pointed to the Philippines with freedom of press leading to a big misinformation environment. But like the obvious criticism you could make if you were in the opposition is like when you have essentially one party rule for decades and decades, can you really trust the government to be the unilateral arbiter of what's true and not essentially just be using what's good for the PAP as the basis for what they allow to be run? And if they are doing that, is it even bad? I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think, if you have trust, if the people have trust in institutions, it's not a problem, right? And in Singapore, I mean, the PAP gets elected in every election in very large majorities, so it's very hard for me to say that there isn't trust in institutions, and the polling there shows that they do trust the institutions because they also keep delivering. I think, in a place like Turkey or Russia or many other countries where people have very little institutional trust, something like that might be more problematic. But, the American idea of freedom of press as it exists within the United States is extremely unique in terms of its liberality. Very few countries have those kind of rules. Um, Freedom of speech and freedom of press in the way that Americans have it is basically unparalleled. And personally, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I don't have problems with restrictions on freedom of speech or press. Um, and even in the United States, when there has been times of crisis, there has been censorship. There has been limitations on freedom of speech and freedom of press. Like in World War One and World War Two, that existed, and the Civil War it existed. Whenever there's been a crisis in America, they've done that.
I think that America also, probably because at our constitutional level, it's so hard to regulate speech, has gotten pretty good at using this sort of semi-soft power. Like, think
Yeah,
of
that was the next
how,
thing I was gonna say. Like you will just get frozen out if you
talking about the
say,
COVID
yeah,
lab leak, right? That was never illegal, but there was still a massive sort of distributed uh,
yeah.
effort to
Sometimes I
suppress that speech.
wonder. Sometimes I wonder if, like, the lessons from Singapore, how applicable they are to other countries. In particular, like, I wonder, like, running a city state,
Yeah.
does that model actually scale to a country the size of a continent like
Like
the
the
United
first
States?
thing he says in the book is like, this is not an instruction manual because you
Yeah,
can't replicate this, so don't try. But then
I
like the
don't think
name
he
of
would.
one of the first chapters is like how to build a nation. So he's sort of there are sort of, notes in both directions on that. I don't know.
I
Yeah.
don't. I don't think
I'm
he
not
would
a
say that.
flamethrower.
Like I think I think maybe you guys just haven't gotten to the part of the book yet. But he does talk about how he doesn't think that Singapore's model is for everyone. I think a good example of this is with Vietnam. He was actually consulted for the liberalization of the Vietnamese economy, and he told, like, they were asking him like, oh, what sort of products should we, invest in? Like, what should we gear our economy towards? And he said to them, the fact that you're asking this shows that you're central planners, that you're not thinking under a free market mindset. And he's like, I can't tell you like what things are going to work and won't work for Vietnam. These are things you're going to have to try and fail at and fix and experiment and figure out on your own. Um, and
I guess
Vietnam, like is closer than like say the UK would be, or Peru or the United States.
Nathan,
I,
can you define for me the difference between central planning, pejorative, and industrial policy, positive? Because I've heard both kind of back to back now from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we think of central planning, like think of like you have a state-owned entity that is run top down, right, and planned out. So I think a good example to think of in a free market economy would be something like the NHS, where everyone is an employee of the government. Everything is run by like a government minister. All the planning for like new hospitals, new clinics, standards of care are done by the government. Whereas industrial policy would be things like tax subsidies, quotas, loans, like it's all being run privately, but the government is doing all zoning. The government is doing all sorts of things to facilitate the business.
While still allowing the businesses to succeed or fail on their
Yeah, like
business.
it's still like industrial policy. When I say industrial policy, I'm talking about like actual industrial policy. Like I think in my mind, the biggest failure of the current Trump administration tariff policy is that there is no industrial policy. There is just the tariffs. Like it would be one thing if you were handing out, you were creating infrastructure and building infrastructure to replace um, and help American companies be able to compete internationally. But if you're just slapping the tariffs on, you're just raising input prices. It doesn't really make sense to me.
What do you think about all this, Kenny?
uh, I guess again, I think about scalability of different models. Like, for example, freedom of speech. Maybe you can have a pretty high trust society when your population is like in the millions to 1 million to 10 million people, and it's just in a small island, and you don't necessarily need the freedom of speech to keep people honest. But once you get to like 300 and 400 million people, does that still apply? I don't know. But it feels to me like eliminating freedom of speech, at least as someone who likes to talk in front of a camera and not be constrained in what he says in America, I feel like eliminating freedom of speech, I would be opposed to it. In terms of industrial policy versus state planning, I think Nathan's drawing a pretty important nuanced distinction in the sense that like if you say state planning is the extreme of like what Russia, the USSR was doing, or what China pre Deng Xiaoping was doing, then that's I think been proven not to work very well. Um, However, if you have it does, given how just the economics of certain industries, specifically like manufacturing, for example, and heavy industry, how important capital formation is and how important economies of scale are. There's a pretty strong argument to be made for industrial policy, but I think it is very important. It kind of gets a little fuzzy between industrial policy and state planning. I think it's very important that you don't pick like a national champion that can't fail, and I think it's very important that you like try to support entrepreneurial pursuits in that industry uh, while not like I guess picking winners and losers. And it's very difficult to do in practice from a political economy standpoint because like tariffs, for example, like the Trump tariffs, for example, like who's to say that like if you are a friend of Trump's or a friend of the Trump family that you can't carve out an exception for your industry? We've seen a few of those, and that ends up like playing favoritism and de facto picking winners and losers from the
Yeah.
government based off of like price signals and markets.
The
Like
one that I thought of, which sometimes the favoritism or the picking is not even deliberate, like there was a big electronics tariff that was going to go into effect, and I've lost track of which ones are actually happening. But I remember they did a big electronics tariff, and then they realized that was going to jack up phones. And they said, okay, we're going to do a smartphone carve out. And I was just thinking, okay, what if this was, 2006, 2007, and smartphones weren't this ubiquitous product, right? Like, which is to say, you don't know what the next smartphone is going to be, right? And you're smothering it. You're creating this inertia, right? When you're doing these carve outs by hand for certain product categories. Yeah, no, that all makes sense, Nathan. I think you're pretty astute on that. One thing I thought that was funny that he said in talking about the communists, whom he pretty much expelled, and
He
I think
hates them. Yeah.
needed to, given the influence of the uh, PRC in the region, was that he says outright in the book that China stopped being communist in the 80s, which
Yeah.
I agree with. It was just funny to see it stated so plainly.
I mean, he says, like in a speech that he gave, he said, and he says this in the book too, that Deng Xiaoping is a great man. And it's
Yeah,
difficult to think of another figure in human history, let alone the 20th century, who has uplifted more people out of poverty, who, in terms of, if you were to put like a scoreboard of who has done the most amount of good for the greatest amount of people, it's difficult to think of another leader apart from Deng Xiaoping, honestly. Um,
yeah, and
and
in some ways, he was in a good position to do this because there were so many unforced errors on the table that he could just stop doing, right?
yeah, yeah, it's true.
But
But
still,
also, and
he's the man who
also,
did them. Yeah.
yeah, and Mao had centralized power to such a degree that he was able to do it in a way that the USSR, I don't think, was ever capable of doing. You know, like you saw that with Glasnost and Perestroika. Like they never had the power to be able to do the reforms that Deng
Because
did.
the individual republics were too strong.
No, not because of the individual republics, but because the security state and the military, as well as just overall various bureaucrats within the Communist Party, did not allow them to go through, or they went through in a corrupt manner when they tried them. They were never able to do. Um, First of all, the USSR did it way too late, like Brezhnev and Andropov and Chernenko. By the time that they started being like, okay, we needed a reform, it was already too late. They should have done that way earlier. And so this
Yeah.
switch from heavy industry to light industry and consumer goods and services, um, they were late to the party. And a lot of that was because the USSR spent way too much on military, more so than China ever did. And the security services were also way bigger, and they had way more control over the state. And so when they tried to make the reforms, it was just no. And then when they did make the reforms, they were very easily exploitable for corruption. Um, and one thing that Lee actually talks about in the book is that he told Vietnam, do not do a Russian style privatization program. And I think he even told them this before Russia ended up doing it under Yeltsin. Um, because the problem is, and this is what happened in the 90s in Russia, is that they were like, okay, we're going to privatize our companies. Everyone sold their stock immediately, and it was the oligarchs
Oh
bought up
yeah,
the shares.
he
Yeah,
called this stagging in the book. He says, yeah, everybody dumping their free shares
yeah,
immediately. We call it dumping in crypto, but yeah, he called it stagging, which I assume is a British term. Yeah.
yeah. So he was telling Vietnam explicitly, like, do not do this strategy, which Russia just ended up doing, and is why Russia has an oligarch class, and
Uh-huh.
why the 90s were so terrible in Russia. Um, and Vietnam didn't do that, and instead they fostered entrepreneurship and like slowly, surely weaning themselves off the state corporations. Trying to get the state corporations to be more competitive, similar more to what China did. Um,
And I think this shows to what you guys were saying about him as a pragmatist. Like, I think there are a lot of people who have there's such like a team sports mentality or like a rival blocks mentality that it's not enough for China to adopt markets. Like we have to actually overthrow the hammer and sickle, like in the red flag. Like people get hung up on the symbology, right? like he has nothing against working with people who are like in name communists. It's all about like the pragmatism of the policy, foreign and domestic. You know,
Yeah,
and there is
absolutely.
something to be said for that.
And I think, in terms of the ideological fervor, I think you see that in the former Soviet Union in terms of like you had people come in who were free market ideologues, and they caused probably the greatest drop in human standard of living and life expectancy in all metrics in hundreds of years. That was not done by war or plague or whatever.
At the end of the Soviet Union,
Yeah, like in 1995, I think it was, when Russia was at its worst, it was at like an African level standard of living, like, and even
and
in
this
the
was a result
place,
of corruption. I mean, that's my outside
no,
view.
it isn't even a result of corruption. It's because, like, you have a centrally planned economy, you have generations of people not living under a market system, and then all of a sudden, you're telling them, okay, you don't have a job anymore, you don't have a workplace anymore, your town, your entire city doesn't have any industry anymore. And even in the countries that were formerly communist that got out of this very well, like let's say East Germany, in East Germany in the 90s, it was still rough. East Germany is still not converged with Western Germany, despite all the money that Western Germany has poured into it. Everyone lost their job in the 90s. The 90s were hard for everyone, and that was even with all that support. And then in Russia, it's only been in the last like 10, 15 years that they've even reached the standard of living that they used to have. And now Russia's above the EU average in terms of PPP per capita. But, it took them a lot to get to that. And
So
it was
is this
only
all to say that you think a Vietnam or a Deng style soft market liberalization is superior to the hard shock? I mean, it seems pretty obvious. Superior to the hard
obviously,
shock that happened in Russia.
obviously, I don't think anyone at this point can say otherwise. Like, you look at when did Russia's economy start to recover? Why does Putin have so much support in Russia? It's because he moved everything to a soft liberalization. And Kenny, you mentioned earlier about like Russia and the rule of law and things. And I mean, while Russia does have these problems, there's startups in Moscow and St. Petersburg. There's a dynamic economy. Their economy has actually done quite well despite the sanctions and the war. And even before the war, they've gone past the EU in terms of PPP. Like, the Russian economy has done very well. The diversification efforts have done pretty well. They've weathered sanctions. And I think that speaks to the strength of doing this soft liberalization, um, instead
I
of
want
just
to
being like
I
poof.
wonder if
go
it's
ahead,
about
Kenny.
I wonder if it's about economic liberalization per se and more about like state collapse. Like the Chinese party, like the Communist Party in China or Vietnam, like they never really lost political power, political control. Like the state continued, whereas in Russia there was just complete state collapse. When you go from a society where the state pretty much controls almost every facet of the economy to there's no state, I feel like it doesn't matter what reforms or other things you're doing. Like if you have that level of state collapse, it's going to be an uphill battle. Now, I'm not an expert in Russia. I'll never wouldn't claim to be. I don't definitely not an expert in that period of history, but I do know that like if something, I mean, this is I think one of the benefits that Singapore had, like when the British pulled out. Like it wasn't like a here today, gone tomorrow thing. It was a gradual, relatively gradual transition, and like
In
after the
Singapore?
British, there was in Singapore, there was still the American like security umbrella in the region, in the background, and there was still free and open markets for Singapore to export to. Like, I wonder how the Singapore story would have been different if there was no like U.S. market for them to sell their goods into.
And I guess this is what I meant, and I think I said the wrong thing when I said globalist, but I guess what I was trying to say by that, as far as a free trade mindset, is that, I understand why he said from third world to first. I think that's pretty clear pretty early on, is that he was like, all these third world countries are basically proudly nationalizing or rejecting foreign multinational corporations in the name of sort of an ethno-nationalist decolonialism. And
Hmm.
we are going to do the opposite, right? Like we're going to integrate, we're going to literally join international banking, etc. Right? Like, was that kind of your takeaway too?
Yeah, I thought that was, I think, a good compare and contrast to like how much more effective, with the benefit of hindsight, that approach was versus what I think the prevailing wisdom was at the time that he was in power, like the 60s and 70s.
I think it also, in the 60s and 70s, he was going up against the consensus of import substitution theory, which the entire developing world was like, oh, if we have, if we're looking at like a spreadsheet of all the goods that we're deficient in, we should just try to make those goods here instead of utilizing comparative advantage. And he, as like an entrepot, you know, was like, well, as an entrepot, this makes no sense for us to do. We should just specialize in what we're good at. And I mean, those are the things that the other Asian tigers did as well. Like Taiwan did this with chips. South Korea did this with all sorts of the various goods because they're also a larger
Yeah.
economy.
I mean, they were
Um,
so good at it that they actually, I mean, they caused a tremendous amount of Western anxiety over things like, obviously Bangladesh and Indonesia got very good at clothes to the point where people in the West started freaking out about the cost of these clothes. So great was the comparative advantage. I want to float something, and you guys can either give your take or push back on this depending on how you feel. But I got this takeaway for Lee Kuan Yew personally. It seemed like there were two very big things at play. He was from this relatively well off, but not aristocratic Chinese merchant family with these sort of Confucian values. He says Confucian values a lot in the book. And he also clearly had this affinity for this British upper class education, right? In this social set. He talks about, his golf and all these things. You look at the photos, there are photos in my copy of my book, and he looks so at home among the British ruling class, right? Which is part of, I think, why he did such a good job with the handoff. But it's he talks about multiculturalism in Singapore, and obviously you have various ethnicities, but like the biggest minority, you have the Malay, and the multicultural thing to me, he almost gets close at a couple times to admitting that line is basically just a way to make the mostly underclass Malay like not get really mad about like Chinese chauvinism in Singapore. Like how much do you think it's mostly just a socio-political sort of cover when he says it's a multicultural state?
I don't think it's a socio political cover. I think for him, and I think he talks about this like it's an ongoing process. It's not something that can be done overnight. He talks about needing to change not just the attitudes of Chinese, but change the attitude of Malays as well. Um, and but at the end of the day, and I don't think he would dispute this as well, Singapore is a Chinese state, and I think for him, it's in the same way that Israel's a Jewish state with a similar sized Arab minority.
I think he would
Um,
completely object to the
yeah,
idea of Singapore being a Chinese state.
I mean, he literally has a promote Mandarin campaign that's like being done by the state for like a
Yeah.
Chinese identity. And he talks all the time about how like it is a Chinese majority who Singapore is a Chinese state in all but name. Um, the Malays and the Indian population are full Singaporeans, but he even talks about sending his kids to Chinese schools. He talks about, um, especially when
He
he was
really
doing the
frames that
army,
as a personal choice, though.
but he
He's
also
saying,
talks
I
about
want
how
my
in the
kids to be in touch with their roots, right?
he said too though that he needs them for the next generation because he wants Chinese Singaporeans and for Singapore to have a more Chinese identity. And I think he even froze the Malays out of the military. which I think is probably like all you really need to know. Um,
Yeah,
like the military and the institutions of Singapore are Chinese, and they're ethnically Chinese. There might be Malays and Indians who populate them, but it
yeah.
is a Chinese state. And
Well, I guess that's in a way you said no and then you ended up saying yes to what I asked, which is, is this commitment to multiculturalism mostly just
well, no,
on the surface?
I'm saying that because like you can still have a multicultural society while having like a dominant ethnic character. Like not every country needs to be a new world country, you know. Like Germany or the UK are also multicultural societies, despite the fact that they are, British and German states. Uh, I don't see the contradiction.
I see what you're saying. I think it just comes down to what a Chinese state means.
I, to me, I think there's a difference between being like Chinese in principle versus like Chinese de facto, like in practice. Like it feels like he's going out of his way, certainly in the early days when they were surrounded by like a hostile Malay population outside of the island, that he went out of his way to make sure that it was not Chinese in principle and really reiterated that a lot of times. I maybe the tune changed over time, but it felt like to me even today, Singapore is not Chinese in principle, but it's due to the fact of its ethnic makeup, Chinese in practice. In a similar way that like maybe America isn't English Anglo in principle, but it is quite Anglo in America in practice. Like we have a lot more. Like Americans have a lot more in common with like people from Australia than we do with say people from Colombia, even though Colombia is a lot closer geographically.
Yeah, like I just think that obviously like the multicultural stuff he goes at great lengths to do, but to me it seems obvious that Singapore is a Chinese state and was always a Chinese state, and everyone viewed it, more importantly, as a Chinese state, regardless of whatever he was doing internally.
What? Okay, can you define a Chinese state? Like, obviously, there's Chinese in the sense of being allied or a subject of the PRC, which doesn't apply here. Chinese itself refers to so many ethnicities. I mean, it's a whole school of dialects and languages, some of which are not
Well, he
mutually
even tried
intelligible.
he even tried to foster a unified Chinese identity within Singapore through Mandarin, right?
Yes, he did,
When I
and he
when I
said, okay,
say
all the
Chinese,
Chinese we're going to speak is going to be Mandarin.
I mean, look, when you say that, like, when Singapore is what, like 70% Chinese, something about that, right?
I don't have it
Like
on
more?
hand.
I think it might be more even. But anyway, like when it's at that percentage, you know, countries are accused of being ethnostates at those numbers. Those are not dissimilar numbers to lots of ethnic republics. Everyone, the Malays viewed it as a Chinese republic, the Indonesians viewed it as a Chinese republic, the entire Commonwealth viewed it as a Chinese state. To say that Singapore is not a Chinese state, I think, is a bit ridiculous. Like, obviously, it's a multicultural society, which is what he was going for. And he went to great lengths to do this in terms of like where you lived, like each apartment block you couldn't segregate yourself into different neighborhoods, like each apartment block has to have a certain amount of
Yeah.
ethnic
And
families
this
in
is a
each.
great, I
Yeah.
actually want to bring this up because this is one thing that struck me is that Lee Kuan Yew online, one of the reasons that I wanted to read this book is because he's almost become sort of like a chud adjacent shorthand for a certain kind of illiberal liberalism or whatever you want to call it, with a whole lot of fans.
Wait, I
Fans
have a
who,
question. What's a chud adjacent? What
what
is
is a
chud?
chud? A chud is just a conservative who's too online, I think. Is there a better definition, Nathan?
I think not just a conservative. I think that's a bit unfair to conservatives. I think it's especially since, well, I won't say anything. The like To be a chud, I think, is to be right wing to the point where it's cringe. I think is the more important distinction here. Like, no one would
Yeah.
ever call someone a chud endearingly.
Like I don't. Well, they sort of refer to themselves in this way, but it's a bit of a reclamation of a slur, right?
Yeah, it's more of a slur.
Like I
Yeah.
don't think you would call Ronald Reagan a chud, right? Like there's a certain
No,
fringeness to
no, no,
it.
no. Yeah.
Mm.
So this is all to say, sometimes I feel like the egregore of Lee Kuan Yew is not the actual Lee Kuan Yew that I find in the book, right? Like I don't think that, for example, setting quotas and caps on the racial makeup of the police so that only certain races would be policing themselves, right? Like the Malay would be policed by Malay cops. Like I don't know if these chuds per se would actually like want that in America. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think, like he defines himself as an illiberal liberal, like that's his whole push with Asian values and being against like Western liberal democracy and how he's not trying to associate with that. I think in terms of a lot of the things that we would identify as woke, I don't think he would identify as woke at all. In fact, his son, who is later Prime Minister of Singapore, and I think another Prime Minister, like they even said, like we do not. They said they used the word woke explicitly, saying we do not want like woke ideology to spread to Singapore. That
Yeah.
was like the official PAP stance. Um,
But it's not like a
and
one to one because, for example, like they're super into banning smoking, right? Like that's woke coded in the US, right? But it's not woke
it's
coded in
woke
that
coded
sense in
in the
Singapore.
it's woke coded in the US, right? But they also like, like they literally do caning and have capital punishment in Singapore. And uh I think in terms of like what you're more so talking about is like just the libertarian versus like authority, like how comfortable are you with like the state intervening with your in your life, which I don't think is either here nor there. Like you look at like Richard Nixon, right? Richard Nixon was the greatest school desegregator in American history. He's a right winger. Uh, he's probably the most closest person, American president, who's done anything similar to what Lee Kuan Yew did in terms of like multiculturalism in that specific way. But also Lee himself, he loved Thatcher. He was completely done with neoliberalism. He would
Yeah.
identify himself on the right completely. Uh, to the extent he has socialist roots, I think is not. I mean, not even that he necessarily disavowed them. Is just that like he sees them as just he really outgrew them. Like he saw it as a way for like a independent Singapore, but then they're on their own, and it's like, okay, well, what are we going to do now? And I think it just means that he's not an ideologue against the state. I think American conservatives have this brain disease where they're allergic to the state doing anything at all. And they think that the state having any sort of like capacity or power to affect any sort of change is a bad thing when it's like, Americans pay so much in taxes for nothing. They get back nothing for the amount that they pay in taxes. Especially if you live in a blue state, you're paying like almost European level taxes for no services, basically. Unless you live in like New York City, and even then, you're not getting anything.
I think these services do exist. I've come into contact with them. The thing is, they're either and they are very inefficient. They're just so income capped with a really big cliff, right?
But
To the
not even
point
a
where you
really big.
essentially have to not work to
Yeah,
get the
that's what I mean.
benefits of these blue state services.
Yeah, you have to not work to get these services,
Yeah.
which is
Like it's
ridiculous.
like social democracy only for people who don't work is my practical experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that would line up with my experience as well. Like I remember in COVID, I was in California for the early part of it before I went to Florida, and I tried signing up because I lost my job and I didn't qualify for unemployment. I tried signing up for Medi-Cal and food stamps, and first of all, it took me like a really long time to get the signed up, and by that time I got a job, and then I was kicked off. And then the amount that I got for food stamps was like nothing because I'm like a single guy.
Yeah, a lot of the, especially in LA County, a lot of the food stamp and food stamp related programs are specifically for women and women with children.
Yeah, and not just that, but also, like, I'm not even just talking about a safety net in terms of what you're paying for. I'm saying, like, transport, you get nothing in America for the amount you pay in taxes, right? Uh, Even retirement benefits are not that great, despite Social Security being such a gaping hole. Healthcare, right? Obviously, I don't even need to go into. Um, State services, in terms of them being efficient and like you being able to interact them to get with what you need, it's a joke. Uh, the roads, public infrastructure, everything.
Okay, now this sort
Playgrounds,
of comes back to
parks, like everything.
Kenny's thing.
Like,
Is there a
yeah.
point to trying to do this at a scale of 300 million people? Is federal really the level of organization at which to try and achieve Singaporean efficiency in the United States?
I don't know. I think it's. I think the political economy in the United States right now makes it pretty much very difficult. I think like one of the things that really frustrates me about the U.S. politics in general is the political economy feels so dysfunctional that like even perhaps like fairly realistic good policies become kind of infeasible to implement at a national scale. Just and I think this is the thing that I admire about Lee Kuan Yew and the Singaporean society is just how pragmatic they are and how they're really just focused on like getting the job done and less about ideology. Whereas you go to the U.S. and this is a criticism I would apply almost equally to Democrats and Republicans in the sense that they're very ideologically motivated, or at least the people running the ship in the parties are like very ideologically motivated, and it becomes kind of impossible to have like a constructive policy dialogue at this point in time, and it makes me kind of just not kind of want to just check out to be honest about what's going on in America because it just feels like intractable from a political standpoint.
I think in the US, I think we need to make a distinction between federal officials and state and local officials,
Yes.
because I will say, and this is my opinion, the red states, they're just run better. The red cities are run better. Uh, they're building houses. Their public infrastructure works. Uh, their government like entities and systems like courts, DMVs, different various agencies, they work. You know, uh, like it's very very difficult for me to like if we want to talk about at the state and local level in terms of ideological rigidity, it really has to be on the Democratic side. And especially like you look at like New York, where it's like, apparently they want to implement like a Chinese Hoku system where you have like an internal passport in terms of like being able to immigrate to New York. And then you look at like Los Angeles, where you can't even build houses to replace the ones that were burned down in Pacific Palisades. Uh, and then you look at the amount of you pay in taxes in these states compared to like what you would pay in Florida or what you would pay in Texas. And then you look at all the people moving there. And if we're going to talk about like pragmatic and, which states and cities are actually implementing zoning policies that make sense, which of them are doing things, which of them are actually also in terms of if we're going to talk about state capacity, and I know I just said that like a lot of American conservatives have this brain virus against the state. Look at what cities and what states are actually building actively subways and rail systems. Think of like a lot of it's in Texas or is in, it's not in Los Angeles, it's not in San Francisco, it's not in Boston or New York or Chicago.
I will say, living in a blue state and dealing with this, there are sort of three things. No, just two. Just two. The environmental thing is not a real concern. People use CEQA, which is the way you don't build anything in California, and all these environmental reviews as cover for their preference to keep their neighborhood the way it is. And they want to keep their neighborhood the way it is because they like it. They like their post war homes. They like their level of density. They don't care about their lot value increasing that much. They just want their neighborhood to stay the way it is, right? And so they use all these tools, zoning and CEQA, et cetera, to keep it the way it is. The other one is that and Lee talks a lot about this, labor really has a grip on government and even government contracts. And it's not just labor. Actually, it's capital too sees government projects as a money hose. My father-in-law is in roofing, and so he does a lot of private and public contracts. In fact, I actually think he only does private, but he knows people who do public. And he says the common sentiment here in Los Angeles is that something is going to cost about 5 times more if it's public for the exact same thing, depending on just whether it's the government or private capital paying for it, right? So, of course, it's going to be hard not just to build homes because of this environmental review and all these legal barriers, but also to build infrastructure, to do the very industrial planning that guys are talking about, right? When you have this massive cost disease on building anything.
This is why I think it's good. One of the saving graces of the United States political system is that it's so federated, both at like city level and state level, because that lets like different cities and states do different things. And like it's one thing like if you are in California and everything's hard, everything's expensive, but it's another thing to be in that situation and then look like not so far away at Texas and see like, oh, like actually things are cheap, they're building stuff, this is possible. And that makes, I mean, I'm not, this isn't like a prediction, but it's a lot easier to imagine. I mean, you can kind of getting the sense, like seeing like the stuff, the agenda that Gavin Newsom has been pursuing the last few months of trying to like take a crack at like a different approach to running California. And it's hard to imagine that happening if there weren't examples of culturally, geographically, economically similar places around the country doing things a different way and having a lot of success.
And I think this is the best this is the best part of bad political ideologies. Because on the surface they have nothing to offer besides chaos and turmoil. But you look at, okay, say Trump tariffism, whatever, like having some sort of sick appeal. Would the Democrats have ever actually tried to even reform or do any of these quality of life things without feeling like they're default dead, right? Like they're going to get their asses kicked forever if they don't actually deliver, And similarly, I actually think the communists really lit a fire under the PAP in Singapore, which is not to say that Lee didn't just have this innate drive to make things good, right? But it's like there's kind of a gun to your head if you are trying to build a good nation in the 60s, because the Red Dragon is right there and people will vote them in if they think you're screwing up, Like you think of like how he talks about, like he basically says the Republicans lost in China because they were corrupt and had bad monetary policy and inflation and everyone thought they were dumb, right? Like he really does kind of throw like the whites under the bus in China. And I feel like he's sort of defining the PAP by contrast there and their commitment to, I mean, they literally wore their white shirts like Roman senators as a physical symbol of their cleanliness, right? And being like non-corrupt. That was why they wore them. And I think the opposition sometimes makes you improve your own standards for yourself.
I think there's something to be said about the US losing something with the fall of the Soviet Union in the same way that Rome lost something with the fall of Carthage. and then Rome just proceeded to eat itself from inside. Uh, the Soviet Union, and I'm not the only person to say this, the Soviet Union kept the US honest, for lack of a better word, and within Europe as well. Like the Europeans felt way under the gun, like you're saying, Cairo, in terms of like they felt like they had to have healthy societies, or there was always a looming communist threat that could get voted in. And the US too had to be more innovative. It had to offer money to the world. It had to have a healthy economy and be leader of the free world in competition. But without this competition, you know, the U.S. is, and you're seeing and I think this actually segues into something well that Lee talks about at length in the book, is how much the British just kind of gave up on their empire, even when it like wasn't completely necessary. And the British, like the Cold War was pretty much just the trajectory of the British looking continuously inward as they declined. And I think you're kind of seeing the same thing now happen with the US. Um, like the US is looking more and more inward. People are becoming more and more allergic to intervening abroad, to being involved with anything outside the US. And it's you're seeing too this just more isolation, more internally looking, like more decline, more eating itself from the inside, not wanting to compete with other countries.
And I guess you could argue all day about what is the cause and what is the effect there. They do seem to correlate. He talks a lot. I'd say every other chapter he brings up what he feels was a complete own goal on British
Yeah.
primacy after the
Hmm.
war in terms of, what he basically says, like domestic policy that encouraged people to not work, right? And
Hmm.
ballooning internal spending. Like he basically talks about the NHS as this huge model of like what he didn't want. And he specifically rejects two things. He rejects the idea of every citizen being entitled to the same level of healthcare as being infeasible. And he rejects, I think, a lack of copays as leading to waste in the healthcare system. Now, I would actually be curious to know 15 years, 25 years after this book ends, how the Singaporean healthcare system is doing
I mean,
today.
it's excellent. It's still one of the best in the world, and it's very efficient. Like, I think the biggest uh, thing that you could say about his book is that he wrote it a while ago, and Singapore is an even wealthier country now.
Yeah. One thing he doesn't, in the healthcare section, one thing he didn't talk about, he talks about private insurance schemes being expensive in the US because of diagnostic tests. And I think that might be
Yes.
a real oversimplification.
No, I don't think it's
Um,
an oversimplification. This is something that everyone says in every healthcare model that's not the US, is that the US does way over diagnosis in terms of doing these sort of tests, unnecessary tests all the time. And I can say I've used four different healthcare systems outside the US. None of them do anything like the tests in America.
I just don't believe that that is where the real cost is coming from. And I guess I'm not an expert, but something that I've seen brought up a lot is essentially the supply capping of doctors through regulatory policy that is lobbied for by um, professional associations, right? Essentially, like unions with another name that fight for these very. I mean, Kenny, we know people who have gone through this. These very brutal, hazing-esque practices to get people, turned into doctors with many, many, many years and so much money, right? And limits on how many can join. Like, it's all designed to keep the cost high. That's the point.
I think whenever you have a system as dysfunctional as U.S. healthcare, it's never just like, oh, it's just one thing. It's like a confluence of probably a dozen things or more, all like in a giant twisted negative feedback loop. Um, I mean, I don't even. It's like hard to know where to
Most
start.
most
Like,
of the costs in America are not labor costs though. It's administrative costs, and it's also just that like it's completely ballooned because also the standard of care, like Americans care about having like a good bedside manner with like nice facilities and like oh your doctor's nice to you and he like does all these things for you and you get all these extra tests and like you get the fancy new meds and the fancy new equipment and things. And other countries simply just don't care about these things. Like you look at like what if you go to like an NHS hospital, which is extremely cost efficient, even if the care isn't as good, uh, or if you go even to like a developing world country and you like pay for good healthcare there, or you go to systems that have very good, decent healthcare, like let's say on the European continent or where I live, you will get treatment and it will be good treatment and you will live a long lifetime, but you will not get the fancy new medications. You will not get the fancy new medical equipment. Uh, the facilities will not be as nice. The doctors and the nurses will not have a nice bedside manner. Uh, it is not a frills service. Americans think of healthcare as a good and as a service instead of an infrastructure thing. And I think that's like the biggest issue there. Like you look at like all the ballooning costs at every level of the American healthcare system, and yes, administration is a lot of it, but a lot of it has to do also with American consumer expectations because they view it as a consumer good.
Well, and I think that has to do with um, care from doctors started through private practice, and essentially house calls were ubiquitous. That was the way people were treated in America. There's a poster from the early 40s that I always think of that was sort of an anti-public healthcare poster. That's literally what it was. It was against basically forming an American version of the NHS. And it's just this very sort of romanticist scene from the late 19th century of there's a sick, I think it's a teen girl or something like that. She's in her bed and there's a doctor kneeling and there's mom and there's dad and he's evaluating her. And the poster says, "Do you really want the government involved in this scene?" Um, right. And it's like this. That's I mean that's literal bedside manner. He's literally at her bedside, traveling to her home, and in the sleet and hail in the dead of
Yeah,
night. Right. It's very different than a ward. In the sense that you'll find. I
I
don't know.
think another problem in the U.S. is also that this is like a deeper problem that affects a lot of facets of society. But there's like this thing with tort law in the U.S., whereas if you make any small mistake, you could potentially get sued, not just sued for a small amount of money, but for a lot of money. And even if you win, it's still very expensive because you have to pay lawyers in the process. And that's definitely applies to healthcare. And so what you have is a system that's organized not on like how do we deliver the best health outcomes at a population level. Yeah, the system that's like how do we avoid getting sued at a micro level, and that's one reason why they do all these tests,
yeah,
right?
that
One
is
reason
one
why
of the
they
reasons why they do all the diagnosis tests. Yeah. But you're
yeah.
talking about it's such an insane difference though. Like I think the US spends 17% of GDP, the UK spends 7 on healthcare.
Yeah, no, it's like yeah. I mean,
But
there's a million things wrong.
here's the thing. I don't think there's an inherent bad to a nation having a cultural preference for spending a large portion of its GDP on healthcare. After all, we spend a lot of our GDP on useless nonsense, which
But
only gets cheaper and cheaper, especially as we can import it with comparative advantage. I think the salient question is how much juice you're getting for your squeeze, right? Like,
yeah,
it would
but
be fine for the US to spend 17% of its GDP on healthcare if it was still getting a globally competitive amount of healthcare for that spend, right? Like, the issue is where you're not getting what you spend back,
this is part of the
as with
problem I'm talking
administrative costs.
but this is the problem that I'm talking about is that like if you're saying like oh like if we're spending this amount but we're getting our money back for it it's fine. But other countries that do have like a government run or at least government intervened healthcare system they don't view it in this way because to them this is a public infrastructural good that we need to make as efficient as possible to meet our like needs of our population. It is not something that's like, oh, we could spend however much money as possible and it'll be a good thing. I think this is the problem with like, if we're going to talk about the problems with GDP maxing, I think the American healthcare system is a perfect example of this. Like these insurance companies are just leeches and parasites on the American economy. And I say that as like someone who's a registered Republican in the US. Like uh, you look at like 17%, there is no world in which that would be justified. Even if the average life expectancy was 85 years old in America, which it's not. America has a horrible life expectancy. Even if it delivered great numbers, that's still insane. Like every other OECD country spends less than this by like magnitudes.
I mean, I will say, I don't think that a low life expectancy is necessarily evidence that the American healthcare system is ineffective, because we could just make really bad choices far in excess of other countries to the point where it would be even lower, right, with a lower level of spending. I don't know.
I get your point, but like
Um,
Americans are not more obese than a lot of other developed countries. Like, yes, it's a problem, but it's not more. Americans don't
yeah.
even smoke or like drink that much more than other developed countries. There are developing countries that have a higher life expectancy than America, and it's embarrassing.
And I think where you really get the point home, and almost everyone can agree with this, is with such things as administration, which obviously you want to minimize, right? Like obviously you want administration to be as low a percent of the expenditure as possible, and it's absurd that it's not.
I mean, I don't
Hmm.
know. I feel like we shouldn't just say like admin should be lower or like the percentage of GDP should be lower, because I feel like this is part of the problem is that there's no, this isn't like in terms of admin should be lower. Like a lot of times, like they say that for like NGOs and nonprofits, but what you have is just like really poorly run like organizations. Or you say like people should spend less money on this thing, but really like people should be allowed to spend however much money they want to spend on whatever they want to spend it. I think the real problem, one of the big problems, is that it's very difficult to like experiment and innovate with like new approaches and new models for healthcare delivery, partially because it's so heavily regulated. And I mean, understandably so, right? Like maybe you kind of want
Yeah,
some kind of quality control in the healthcare system that you don't necessarily need when you're buying a smartphone, for example. But
I
like,
guess. So I guess then this poses an interesting hypothetical. If there was no such thing as the FDA, and each state had its own FDA, right? Would this be a more fertile situation for innovation where, say, Texas or Arizona might come up with some really good policy, or even just allow it to form through the free market through
I,
regulating
I
less?
don't think that's really
Yeah.
relevant though, because the FDA kind of just approves everything, especially compared to the Europeans or the Chinese or the Japanese or other drug agencies. Like the FDA is notoriously liberal, which is also why there's a lot of biotech in the United States.
well, it's liberal compared to them, to like its peers, but in terms of the amount of things that people could try,
But like
it's
which
pretty
country
constrained.
would have like more liberal like laws in this way?
I'm not comparing it to other countries. I mean, in comparison to other countries, it probably is more liberal, but in comparison to the amount of things that could be tried
Sure,
from
Kenny, but
a
like,
healthcare,
like
the
I can
FDA,
tell you
right,
how
is
much I
also just
pay in tax. I can tell you how much I pay for like my healthcare contribution out of my taxes and like exactly, and it's like what, like $40 a month, I think, something like this, you know? And that gets me like better healthcare coverage than like a premium plan in like any major healthcare insurer in the United States.
Well, this a lot of this is because everything is more expensive in the US because the dollar is so strong and wages are so high and property is so expensive, and you
Sure,
can't
but
import
even if you
healthcare the way
tripled
you
it,
import iPads.
even if you tripled it or quadrupled it or quintupled it, like I like there's no deductible, there's no copay. There's none of this stuff. Like it's ridiculous to me. I'm sorry. Like I think it's, like the US is literally the only country in the world that has this system that everyone else thinks is uniquely evil. Like not just stupid, but like evil.
I think that
Like I was like it's like
I
even
think
right
that when
wingers.
they are enjoying a drug that was developed through the R&D of an American biotech company that is allowed to exist and generate revenue through our model, they perhaps discount the way that they're benefiting from the American system.
But you look at the countries
Well,
that
I
have
definitely
like
don't want to
really,
defend the U.S. healthcare system. That's for sure.
but you look at like the countries that do have really healthy like biotech infrastructures, and they're not in the US right now. And even in the US, like, these drug companies would still exist. Like, if you're saying, like, oh, like these drugs and these life science type tools and technologies only exist because they charge Americans like a really high rate and then the rest of the world doesn't pay as much, well, then it just sounds like America's getting cucked. Like, I don't know how else you like, I don't know why you would be okay with this.
All right. I'm sure there is someone out there who is actually a policy expert on this who is just screaming with steam coming out of their ears. So I think the best thing for us to do is bring someone like that on, and we can maybe even the three of us all talk to them. And for now, I think we should probably circle back more to reflections on the book and Singapore in particular, because we're not going to solve American healthcare today.
One thing I noticed in the book, in the acknowledgement section, he thanks his publisher for making his language more politically correct and less chauvinistic. And I felt like that was like and he puts it in a way where it comes off as like somewhat catty. Like, is he really thanking her, or is he just like, I can't believe the publisher made me like make these stupid changes? And that was a theme I noticed in quite a few chapters where he
Cattiness.
kind
Yeah,
of catty. Like I
he's
feel
very
like he
catty.
did
Yeah.
like something he did with like Malaysia where they I can't really remember, but there was some issues with Malaysia where he was quite catty. I love how even what we view as one of like kind of like the role model for like leadership, government leadership, and statecraft. The 20th century is still kind of
Yeah, it is funny to see him, especially over little slights, get so litigious. But I actually think that this cattiness might be part of the same thing that makes him focus so much on being great or aspiring to greatness, right? Which is this intense focus on his image, right? Or his social standing. Like this can be a motivator for people to do great things, right? For the sake of their social standing.
There's a really good interview that I watched with him where at the end of the interview, which was a bit heated, the interview asked him, do you consider yourself a ruthless man? And he laughed at him and he said, ha, no. And he's like, if I was a ruthless man, I would ask you, why do you treat your interview subjects like they're stupid?
It's so funny.
And
Um,
I think, he's a very charismatic man, like watching his speeches and his interviews. He's very articulate.
I told someone we were recording a Lee Kuan Yew episode and they didn't know who that was, and they said, "Oh, is he coming on the show?" I said, "Oh no, I wish." But I was reading the part where he said that he realized he loves TV and doing TV appearances, and that he felt like he was much stronger on TV than writing in the newspaper. And I thought, oh man, you would have loved podcasts, dude. Oh well. I did like the part where he was trying to use his computer and he kept losing documents and he had to have someone come over and find them on his C drive. I'm sure that'll be us when we're 70 with
Yeah, it
whatever
took him a
technology
while. It
exists.
took him a while to get used to the technology. I also just liked like him talking about his interactions with foreign leaders. Like he also talks about at the Commonwealth meetings when they would all be like complaining about South Africa and Rhodesia, and he would be like, "Why are we arguing about this? Like this, we have like more important things to discuss right now, and like maybe all of us should just be like focusing on our own economies."
Oh yeah, he had a quote that was like, "Well, I'm a settler to Singapore, so if settlers are inherently evil, then we're all in a lot of trouble." Right? Was basically the quote that
Yeah,
he had.
yeah. Yeah, and like
Um,
he apparently gave like a 40-minute like off the cuff speech like in front of the whole like Commonwealth meeting in front of all the leaders, and they were all just he shut them up apparently about it.
this
I
is
think
something, and I go ahead.
no, finish what you were gonna say.
I actually wish. Now, I really like this book, and I really like the anecdotes. I was initially against the fact that he breaks it up by subject and then goes all the way from the 50s through the 90s over and over again because I thought it was a little repetitive and a little staccato, a little stilted. But I came to like it because it's like each one almost is like a fable. I almost started to
Yeah,
see the book as like a collection of fables where it's like if you find yourself trying to fix healthcare, you can be like, oh, let me go read the healthcare chapter. And then it's like it makes it a better reference book. Um, so I think for that reason it was cool. But I do have the same problem with this that I have with any like artist approved biopic, for example, like, oh, this Michael Jackson movie is approved by the Michael Jackson estate. Like, okay, I think we know what's not going to be in it, really. Like, you know, um, for the same thing, like, I would be really curious to know, like, because he's so catty and so obsessed with public image, like, what is salient to his life that was conspicuously omitted? You know, I kept having
he was
that curiosity.
he's very personal. Like he doesn't talk about his family life so much, even though his son went on to become a long-serving prime minister, and his wife was also involved in the government in differing capacities, if I recall correctly. Um, I think he's very, very protective of his family and also of himself as well. Like he talks about how he grew up as like an English speaking home, and like, but even still, he doesn't really give us much about his biography. Um, it's really more about like him as leader of Singapore. We don't really know so much about Lee Kuan Yew, the man.
Well, it's obvious in the book he's constantly fighting off accusations of nepotism and dynastism. Is that a word? Like,
Yeah.
he's like, in the book, he's like, I can't believe these people are saying that I'm just grooming my son to be the next
Prime
leader after
Minister.
me, right? Which, of
Yeah.
course, I know he is. But he's like very offended by this accusation in the book. So that might be one reason to not talk about his family, right? Is if he's worried about this accusation of creating a dynasty.
Another thing that, I mean, Nathan, correct me if I am wrong, and he mentions this later on in the book, but like a big part of Singapore's like capital accumulation over the years was capital flight from oligarchs in Indonesia, the Philippines, and just Southeast Asia in general,
Hmm.
and who knows other parts of the world. And so there, I know that there is like a seedier side to Singapore, certainly as a financial center, that definitely I don't think was ever fully articulated in the book. And I would
Hmm.
have loved not and there's like no judgment, on my end about this, but like I would love to learn more about how that happened and how that worked, and because I feel like quite a few financial centers, places that become global financial centers, started out in that kind of a way, and I would
Yeah.
love to hear more about that story.
I mean, he doesn't really talk about it so much, but I think it's, it's obviously the subtext for everything. Like everyone, I think it's pretty common knowledge, the whole thing about how Singaporeans are very well known for having like their, domestic servants that are like it's borderline slavery or indentured servitude in some ways. I mean, maybe that's like a bit cruel to say because slavery is much worse, but it's weird, I think we can all say. Um, and that's something that's, you know, a lot of people who live in Singapore, it is to be said, are not citizens of Singapore. They are like this underclass that is kind of made to serve the Singaporean citizens in not as extreme as Dubai or Gulf states, but you know, somewhat in that direction at least. Um, and then I think, you know, as much as he is anti-drug and he's very like against any drugs being in Singapore because he thinks that this is an externality that cannot be tolerated, Singapore has legalized prostitution. I'm pretty sure it has legalized gambling. Um, I don't think he's afraid. I don't think he's afraid of vices. I think drugs he thinks are uniquely bad, and he doesn't want them in Singapore. But as much as you have this nanny state where like you can't chew gum, like you can still fuck a hooker, you can still like you know bet all your life savings on a horse race, uh, and I'm sure this like ruins people's lives as well.
I wonder how much of that is due to the tradition of basically starting as a giant naval base. I mean, all these things sound very associated to me with, you know, how people in the armed forces blow their money off base.
I mean, the obvious like you know connection here and comparison that he compares all the time in the book is Hong Kong, right? Which also had a similar policy of like no drugs, but all other vices are more or less tolerated. Um, and you know, the biggest contrast with Hong Kong is that you know he Hong Kong is way more laissez-faire than Singapore is. Like he even has this one line I thought was good, which is like everything is assumed to be allowed in Hong Kong unless it's expressly forbidden, but in Singapore it's expressly forbidden and like it's forbidden unless it's expressly allowed. And he says that this is because
Yeah.
Hong Kong was part of the British common market and it had China and it had the Bank of England, that it had way more advantages than Singapore had completely on its own. And so, you
And
know, the
even that
Singaporean,
quote he presents in the context of a flex, right? And the flex is that in the financial crisis of the 90s,
yeah, 97,
Singapore
yeah.
had less contagion than the neighbors because they had been more conservative with not allowing new risky financial products, right? So he's sort of saying ultimately, even in the places where I left yield on the table, there was an upside to it in terms of stability. It is crazy the GDP growth that they did year over year. And there's a part he's talking about the pension program, the savings program, which it's not like Social Security. It's basically forced private contributions. But he was talking about how every year they were increasing the contribution, but the workers weren't angry because wages were rising so fast that their year over year pay was still going up, even with the increased contribution, because it was just skyrocketing that quickly. It's just, I don't know. It makes me wonder what happens to a country that has had like 50 or 60 years of line going up in excess of global markets if line starts to only go up at the same rate as global markets.
I mean, I think there's also a difference too between wage stagnation and, you know, when the gains are more evenly spread. Uh, and, you know, this is something that, like, you know, in the US, wage stagnation has been going on since the 80s, whereas pretty much most other developed countries have had their wages catch up to the US or even surpass in many cases. And I think that just points to like a different type of scleroticism. Like the US would have had that in the 50s and 60s, which is not that long ago.
Yeah, it is interesting. There are certain things, it's so obvious, you know, people ask, and I'd actually be curious to get both your takes on this. There's this big question of what happened in 1971, which is a year that a lot of people point to as this sort of stagnation of like everything, right? Obviously, you can point to the price of oil, but I don't know. The
Uh,
U.S. has seemed uniquely affected by this in some ways that the rest of the world hasn't.
I think anyone who points to I think anyone who says that the gold standard going off it was a bad thing, I think they're stupid and like illiterate, and their opinion isn't valued, honestly. Like, if we went on the gold standard, if we maintain, first of all, it would have been impossible to maintain the gold standard. We got off the gold standard in the best possible way we could. We avoided, and I say this like we, America, not, the entity. Um, when America got off the gold standard, it did it at a much better way than pretty much every other developed economy did. Um, Being on the gold standard or continuing it would not have worked or would not make sense. The oil shocks happened at around that time period. I think the oil shocks, that was what really caused the stagnation of the 70s. And then we're still kind of living in that hangover. And I think that's best way to view it, as a hangover. Like,
Yeah.
there has been growth since then, but at the same time, it's like, I look at I think you also have to like look at building, like, if you're an American and you live in the South, I think you'd be saying a very different thing than if you lived in California or New York.
Interesting. I mean, my pet cause is energy prices, right? And so obviously I'm going to go like, oh, it's nuclear. We didn't build nuclear, and so there's this nuclear shaped hole in our standard of living. Yeah, but I
But
don't know.
but it's
What do
true.
you
It's
think,
not just,
Kenny?
yeah.
But go ahead, Nathan.
No, I was just gonna say it's true though. Like, since, like the 70s is when all of these weird environmental laws got put into place. It's when all of this NIMBY stuff started in the United States. Like, the rest of the world just hasn't done that, and you see them grow at faster rates, and their incomes are catching up or passing. And then the US, which hasn't been building power plants or build roads or bridges or infrastructure or houses, and then it's like, oh, why are things bad all of a sudden? And it's like, well, I wonder why.
I mean, I think there's like whenever you see a trend like this, it's usually not just one thing. It's usually a bunch of things that are all pushing in the same direction and potentially have like feedback loops with each other. I can think of a few things that happened around then. One, of course, is the environmentalist movement and the anti-development movement, which I don't think is like a totally crazy thing to want in the 70s when you think about how out of hand certain things were going. Now, I think right now we're reevaluating it, which I think that reevaluation is long overdue, just like we should be reevaluating a lot of things in our society that are close to 50 to 100 years old. But I don't think it was just that. It was also like around then was also when, globalization was really starting to take off, like containerization. Containerization meaning like shipping containers. It's this very like overlooked innovation because not a whole lot of us encountered or see it in our day-to-day lives. But shipping costs have dropped dramatically starting around then when containerization was becoming more mainstream. And that, and also like trade liberalization across the world, made U.S. Labor working in like kind of the lower skilled jobs compete with pretty much everywhere in the world. And because like to be clear, like it's not average incomes that have gone down. It's not income GDP per capita. It's like the median income that's gone down. And so that points to like the lower end getting kind of having to compete against people, places in China, Mexico, etc. Another trend you can observe is like the baby boomers around them started to really enter the workforce, and labor. And not only was this like the largest generation in American history and the largest labor force in American history, it also like had the highest labor participation with women. This is around the time when like washing machines and dryers became mainstream in America, which opened up which meant like the whole idea of like the homemaker as like a something that women had to do. Because like back in the day, it was like, well, washing, drying, cleaning, all these different chores took up a ton of time, and now all of a sudden women had a lot more time, and many of them entered the workforce. And that, when you increase supply, you're going to reduce the price, and so supply of labor went up. around this time. And I think the last one, which I don't know if I don't think it was because of leaving the gold standard per se, but something happened in like the financial markets. I'm not exactly sure what. I don't fully understand it, but it seems like the way capital formation worked, the rich would get people who already had capital and wealth. That wealth grew faster than the GDP. And I don't fully understand why. I'm not going to claim, but it's like fairly well documented, I think, and analyzed. And it seems like an empirical fact.
There was a interesting
You
article
know,
written by Larry Summers, I believe, in the Financial Times. This was many years ago, I want to say in like 2016, 2015, something like this. And he talked about secular stagnation. And his theory for it was that basically the type of inventions that have been around since if you compare like 1900 and 1950 versus 1950 and 2000, the type of inventions you had from 1900 1950 were capital widening, as in like they allowed you to like produce more stuff. So like think like cars or trains or machinery. But after 1950, and especially like since 1990, it's been capital deepening. It's like comms, it's computers. It like lets you make things more efficiently, but doesn't like you make you produce more. And so that's why there's that disconnect between productivity and wages, is his theory at least.
Fascinating.
Are you guys familiar with this whole like third industrial? I think it's called the third industrial revolution. The first being like steam power, the second being combustion engines, and now we're in like the electronic like age.
No, give us like a 1 minute rundown on that, and then we'll leave the rest for the next show.
Okay, so we're finally reaching a point where not just computers are improving exponentially over time, but like solar panels, battery packs, electric motors. Those are kind of the three main ones. You know, energy creation, energy storage, and then like and taking that energy and like generating power out of it. All of these three things, like the power density of engines, electric motors, the cost of a watt of solar, the cost of a watt of storage from batteries is all improving exponentially. And it's been going on for like multiple decades at this point with no clear like bottleneck that's going to stop it. And so I think what we're going to see in the next 30 years is probably if energy and that type of stuff is what's been holding back like prosperity over since the 70s, we're going to see a lot of that trend start to reverse as like energy becomes extremely cheap.
But wouldn't that mean China just takes over because they have all the rare earths?
Well, I mean, what they do in China, there's no reason why we couldn't do it in the United States if we had to. I mean, it's just a lot easier to buy it from them, I guess, comparative advantage. To me, it's more of a national security thing.
Yeah.
Whether you want to source it from a geopolitical rival or not. As someone who lives in Hawaii, I don't have like as much skin in the game as someone who lives in Texas, but
which is funny because you're much more physically in the game, but I suppose sort of equidistant on both sides. I think we're going to wrap it up here, guys, because we have run a little long and I'm sure people have their days to get to. But I had been wondering, actually, leading up to this episode, why is it that Singapore is so interesting to us? Why is it that this is something we focus on so much? And I think it's obvious from this discussion. When we talk about Singapore, we're talking about ourselves, right? And we're talking about the big questions that we want the answer to because, yes, in the 60s, Singapore was multiracial, but very soon, if not now, everywhere is multiracial, right? Everywhere is trying to pick itself up by the bootstraps, We talk about these like early warning countries like Japan in some ways as a leading indicator, right? But in other ways, I think Singapore is very much a leading indicator. And so we look to Singapore when we're asking, like, what do we do to make a good future, right? Which I think is important to all of us, at least all of us here at Futurist Letters. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I hope whether or not you read the first half of From Third World to First, you found this enlightening. Thank you very much for giving us part of your day. And you can, again, find this on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, and at futuristletters.com through Substack with video. You can also find after show episodes for paying subscribers, just a few bucks a month. After our interview episodes, there is no after show for this episode, but please check it out, share it with your friends, and if you want to sponsor the show, this is where your sponsor message would go. My name is Cairo Smith, and we will catch all of you next week with another interview. We are also going to be talking about the second half of From Third World to First, probably much more briefly than this discussion, in a month. And we will also have some other topics that I'm sure will be to your interest on our next roundtable. So please stick around and come back next month for that. Until then, we will see you around the internet. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.